So 2020 was... Okay, look, I don't need to tell you that 2020 sucked, okay? It's pretty much unanimous that 2020 was a horrible year for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, there were more important things to be concerned about than movies, but there was still a lot of weird stuff that happened regarding movie theaters, and I'm not just talking about the issues with the box office being non-existent for most of the year. Perhaps the most concerning change is one that involves an actual court ruling that went under the radar. I'm talking, of course, about the Paramount Decrees. And what are the Paramount Decrees? Well, let's get a little bit of history here. The decrees came about way back in 1948 after the case of United States v. Paramount Pictures. Now, that's just the name of the case, but the more accurate labeling would be United States v. Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, RKO, and pretty much any profitable studio of the era. These studios were grouped either by the Big Five, which consisted of Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO Pictures, and the Little Three, consisting of Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, and United Artists. The Big Five were more in question, but the Little Three were also apparently violating antitrust laws as well. The trial came about when the FTC started an investigation of the violations under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The film studios of the era were owning their own theaters where their own films were being shown. They would own every part of the filmmaking process, from the production of film to the very distribution, essentially creating an oligopoly. Even more concerning was that the studios were forcing independent theaters into block booking their movies. What this essentially meant is that you couldn't just decide to screen one studio movie at your theater. You would instead have to purchase an entire package of movies. By 1945, 17% of theaters were under the ownership of studios, and something had to be done to prevent further development of an oligopoly. Before that happened, however, there were the consent decrees that acted more like warnings for the studios. This meant a few things. The studios could no longer block book short film subjects along with feature films. The studios couldn't really block book either, but the block size was still kind of there and really only reduced to 5 films. Blind buying, or the act of buying films by theater districts without seeing the films beforehand, would be replaced with what was known as a trade showing, or special screening every 2 weeks, at which representatives of all theater districts in the United States could see films before theaters decided to book a film. And perhaps the most important aspect was the creation of an administration board to enforce these requirements. Now, the studios, however, did not really comply with these rules, and this led to the Supreme Court case in 1948. Though the studios did initially win their case in district court, the Supreme Court ruling was not in their favor. They lost the case, and thus came about the Paramount Decrees. The decrees led to a lot of changes within the movie studio industry. Obviously, the most immediate result was that studios had to shed ownership of their theaters that were specifically owned for distributing their own content. Paramount, trying to save the theaters that they already had, decided to split their company into two as both Paramount Pictures Corporation and the theater chain of United Paramount Theaters, which would eventually merge with the American Broadcasting Company in 1953. Though these decrees arrived at the same time that television was taking off and threatening a slump in the movie industry, a lot of good came about because of this court ruling. For one, more independent theaters would be able to crop up around the 1950s and continue into the 1970s. For two, more independent movies were able to come about as well, without conforming to the demands of big studios. This included better distribution of foreign films as well. And for three, the rise in independent cinema made the Hays production code pretty much crumble, meaning there was far less censorship when it came to what films could be produced. Also, as a bit of a byproduct from these decrees, studios feared that they'd be crowded out of theatrical reruns and instead turned towards television for packaging their films for TV airings. So while it seemed that television was kind of the enemy of the big studios for a time, it actually ended up being of great benefit for them. The Paramount Decrees were a good thing in how they allowed for movies to expand past the archaic Hollywood system and prevent monopolies from forming when it came to film distribution. But then, in 2019, after being unchallenged for decades, the DOJ sought to terminate the Paramount Decrees. Their reasoning was that they believed the major studios did not have the same reach as during the Golden Era to force the same antitrust practices that had once been there before. Naturally, independent cinemas and filmmakers deeply opposed this move for termination. as it would mean bigger studios could further encroach on their turf and shove out smaller theaters and smaller films. But then, on August 7th, 2020, the courts granted the DOJ permission to lift the decrees that are currently in a 2-year sunset termination period. So what will happen with the Paramount Decrees being lifted? Well, it potentially means that studios could theoretically buy their own theater or theater chain and only show their movies at that theater. They could even decide to only show their movies at this theater chain, blocking any other theater from showing their films. This means that smaller theaters that host movies both big and small could be limited to only hosting small films and thus receive far less business. Now, if you're worried that this will mean a studio will buy up a theater to only show their content, you don't need to worry about that happening in the future because, well, it kinda already happened. In fact, it happened before the decrees were ever abolished. In 2019, New York's aged Paris Theater, which had been the last single-screen cinema in Manhattan since 1948, had to shut its doors. But instead of becoming a vacant theater, Netflix, of all services, decided to purchase the property. And as you may have guessed, they're using it to only show their films. They wasted no time with this either. The theater was shut down in August of 2019, and by November of that same year, they were already using it to theatrically screen Marriage Story. Now sure, it's just one theater, but the prospect of Netflix having an entire chain of theaters only showing their films is kind of a scary prospect, especially since the studio has already eyeballed other locations as well. And the fact that this happened to a theater that was built at the same time that the Paramount Decrees were issued is too fitting of a metaphor for the death of the decrees. The reasoning for the termination of the decrees is that the studios held under these rules have shifted greatly, and that new studios within the streaming market are not affected by the Paramount decrees. After all, Netflix was able to swoop in and buy the Paris theater. But the thing is, this only stresses the need for the decrees to be updated with their language to take note of streaming services heading towards an oligopoly. The courts believe that there are enough antitrust laws in place to prevent a similar situation, but there's a lot of uncertainty and loopholes being exploited already that I seriously have my doubts that there'll be enough to prevent a movie theater oligopoly. With the fate of theater chains up in the air due to the coronavirus pandemic, it's a very uncertain time to just say everything is fine regarding theaters, and that the decrees deserve to die, leaving the issues of an oligopoly left up to a patchwork of antitrust laws that may or may not be enough to prevent the industry from going in this direction. Perhaps the worst part is that we won't know the effects that this will have on the movie industry for at least a year, but when so many studios are buying each other up, fusing properties, and resorting to studio-specific streaming services, it's hard to say just what damage will be done to the independent cinema with the removal of the decrees. We have no idea how movie theaters are going to be looking next year in terms of business and ownership. To become lax with the laws in this area is dangerous thinking that could lead to a darker age of movie theaters, where independent cinemas may face a grim future.
If you leave the theater, folks, please be careful. Don't let this happen to your car. Be sure to remove the speaker before you leave. If you should accidentally pull a speaker loose, please turn it in at our snack bar or box office.